polygamy, an ancient practice shrouded in controversy, mystery, and intrigue. But did you know it's not just a cultural relic? It's woven into the very fabric of some of history's most iconic stories, including the lives of legendary biblical figures. Abraham, Jacob, King David, and the famously wise Solomon all practiced polygamy. And here's the twist: they weren't condemned for it. In fact, they were blessed. So why did God allow this? Was it a divine loophole or a pragmatic adaptation to the times? And what can this tell us about ancient societies and the people who lived them? Stick around as we unravel the tangled web of history, scripture, and human imperfection to uncover the real story behind polygamy in the Bible. Trust me, this one is more complicated and more fascinating than you think. This opening aims to capture the audience's curiosity with mystery and historical intrigue while setting a professional and engaging tone that aligns with your target audience's interests. In Genesis 4:19, Lamech, a descendant of Cain, marries two wives, Adah and Zillah. He is the first polygamist recorded in the Bible. However, notice the context. Lamech is also a murderer, a man who boasts about his violence. This early mention sets a tone. Polygamy enters the biblical narrative within a fallen, broken world. Moving forward to Abraham, the father of nations, Genesis 16 presents a pivotal moment. At Sarah's urging, Abraham takes Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, as a second wife. Sarah was barren, and they both believed this was the only way to secure the promised lineage. Hagar conceives Ishmael, and here's the critical part: God does not condemn this act. Instead, he appears to Hagar, blesses her son, and promises that Ishmael will also become a great nation. This isn't an afterthought, it's divine intervention. Polygamy, in this instance, is not condemned but becomes part of God's unfolding plan. Then there's Jacob, whose life reads like a dramatic saga. He works 7 years to marry Rachel, only to be tricked into marrying her sister Leah first. Ultimately, Jacob ends up with 2 wives and 2 concubines, Bilhah and Zilpah, who together bear him 12 sons, the heads of Israel's tribes. Here's an undeniable fact: the foundation of God's chosen people, Israel, comes from a polygamous household. No matter how uncomfortable that might be, it's the truth. The biblical text doesn't shy away from this. It records every messy, complicated detail. Fast forward to David and Solomon, 2 of Israel's greatest kings. David, described as a man after God's own heart, had multiple wives. Yet, God established an eternal covenant with him, promising that his throne would endure forever. Solomon, David's son, takes this even further, with 700 wives and 300 concubines. Yes, Solomon's polygamy is criticized in 1 Kings 11 because his foreign wives lead him into idolatry. However, notice this: the criticism is tied to idolatry, not the sheer number of wives. The text doesn't focus on polygamy as inherently sinful, but rather on how it leads Solomon astray. Even the Mosaic Law does not prohibit polygamy, instead it regulates it. Exodus 21:10 outlines the responsibilities of a man who takes a second wife, ensuring he does not neglect the first. Deuteronomy 21:15-17 provides rules for inheritance in polygamous families, safeguarding the rights of all children. These laws don't merely tolerate polygamy, they legislate it, creating a framework to ensure fairness and justice within these relationships. If polygamy were inherently evil, why legislate it at all? The silence of Scripture on the outright condemnation of polygamy is deafening. Time and time again, polygamous families are used to fulfill God's purposes. Why does this matter? Because it challenges the neat, tidy narrative that many have imposed on the Bible for centuries. The truth is messier, more complex, and often harder to accept. Polygamy's introduction in the Bible is not an afterthought, it's a direct result of humanity's broken state. It doesn't start with heroes like Abraham or David. It begins with Lamech, a descendant of Cain. Lamech's story is brief, but incredibly significant. He is the first man recorded in Scripture to marry multiple women, Adah and Zillah. However, this isn't a love story. Lamech is also the first man to boast about murder, proclaiming to his wives, "I have killed a man for wounding me." His actions epitomize rebellion, arrogance, and violence, showing that polygamy enters the biblical narrative in the context of human sin and moral decay. The Bible deliberately places Lamech's polygamy alongside his other transgressions. He is a descendant of Cain, the man who murdered his own brother Abel. Cain's lineage is marked by rebellion, and Lamech's story reflects the same. Defiance against God and Lamech's actions intensifies the pattern of rebellion introduced in Genesis. Polygamy here is not romanticized. It represents a broader trend of self-indulgence and disregard for God's original design in Eden. One man and one woman becoming one flesh. However, notice something critical. God doesn't intervene. He doesn't strike Lamech down or explicitly declare polygamy inherently evil. Instead, the narrative moves on. This silence is not approval, but challenges us to confront an uncomfortable truth. God often allows humans to act within their brokenness, even when their actions deviate from His ideal. From this point, polygamy becomes more than an individual choice. It evolves into a cultural norm in the ancient Near East. This is key to understanding why it appears so frequently in the Bible. In the ancient world, polygamy wasn't just accepted. It was often seen as necessary. Men married multiple women to expand their labor force, secure heirs, and form alliances. In a patriarchal society where survival depended on the strength of one's household, polygamy wasn't viewed as immoral, it was practical. Consider the broader biblical context. By the time Abraham enters the scene in Genesis 12, polygamy is already ingrained in the cultural landscape. This is the world into which God chooses to work His divine plan. Instead of creating a new society from scratch, He meets humanity where they are, broken systems and all. This explains why polygamy isn't explicitly condemned in the Old Testament. It's not because it is morally ideal, but because God works within human realities to fulfill His purposes. However, polygamy in the Bible isn't portrayed as smooth or ideal. It often leads to conflict, jealousy, and pain. Take the story of Hannah and Peninnah in 1 Samuel 1. Elkanah clearly loves Hannah more, but Peninnah has children while Hannah is barren. This creates a toxic environment of rivalry and bitterness. Yet, even amidst this dysfunction, God hears Hannah's prayers and blesses her with Samuel, one of Israel's greatest prophets. Once again, God's purposes move forward, not because of polygamy, but despite it. Another crucial point is the intersection of polygamy and power in the ancient world. Kings and rulers commonly took multiple wives, not for love, but for political and economic reasons. This is why David and Solomon's polygamy is so significant. It wasn't merely personal, it reflected their status and authority. Yet the Bible doesn't shy away from exposing the negative consequences. David's multiple marriages lead to family strife, betrayal, and even rebellion among his children. Solomon's polygamy, tied to alliances with foreign nations, ultimately contributes to his spiritual downfall. Abraham, often celebrated as the father of faith, also lived a life marked by complexities, with polygamy as a defining event. God promised Abraham he would father a great nation. Genesis 12:2. Yet, when years passed and Sarah remained barren, societal pressure mounted. In ancient Mesopotamian culture, barrenness was not just a personal disappointment but a societal failure. The pressure to produce an heir was enormous, especially for someone chosen by God. Abraham's legacy hinged on God's promise of descendants as numerous as the stars. This is where Hagar enters the story. Sarah, desperate for a solution, offers her Egyptian servant to Abraham as a surrogate wife. At the time, this was not unusual. It was a common practice in the ancient Near East, as documented in texts like the Code of Hammurabi. A barren wife could legally give her maidservant to her husband to produce an heir, and the child born from that union would be considered the wife's. Abraham complies and Hagar conceives. However, what happens next takes a dramatic turn. Hagar, now pregnant, begins to see herself differently. The text notes that she despised Sarah, Genesis 16:4. In other words, her newfound status as the mother of Abraham's child disrupts the household's power dynamics. Sarah reacts with anger and jealousy, blaming Abraham for the situation she orchestrated. She mistreats Hagar so severely that Hagar flees into the wilderness. God intervenes, not for Abraham or Sarah, but for Hagar. An angel of the Lord appears to her, marking the first angelic visitation recorded in Scripture. The angel instructs Hagar to return to Sarah and submit to her authority, but also gives her a profound promise. Her son Ishmael will become the father of a great nation. Genesis 16, verse 10-12. This moment is significant because God acknowledges and blesses the child born out of this polygamous arrangement, even though Ishmael is not the child of the covenant. It raises important questions about how God interacts with human decisions. Hagar's story is not an isolated incident. It's a key part of the narrative. Ishmael's birth does not derail God's plan, but becomes a part of it. Later, in Genesis 21, after Isaac is born to Sarah, Hagar and Ishmael are sent away again. Even then, God steps in to protect them, promising that Ishmael will father 12 rulers and a great nation. Historically, Ishmael is considered the ancestor of many Arab peoples, while Isaac became the father of the Israelite nation. This moment's implications ripple through history, showing how decisions made in a polygamous context have lasting consequences. Jacob's story also highlights polygamy, not as a footnote, but as a central element of the narrative. His marriages to Leah and Rachel, along with his relationships with their maidservants Bilhah and Zilpah, form the foundation for the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob falls in love with Rachel, agreeing to work 7 years for her father Laban. However, Laban deceives him, and Jacob wakes up to find he has married Leah, Rachel's older sister. Laban justifies this by citing local custom, forcing Jacob to work another 7 years to marry Rachel. The resulting household is chaotic. Leah, feeling unloved, seeks validation through fertility, while Rachel, though loved, is barren and envious. Both women give their maidservants to Jacob, intensifying competition. The rivalry escalates further when Leah and Rachel barter mandrakes, believed to enhance fertility, in exchange for time with Jacob. This tumultuous arrangement ultimately shapes Israel's history. Jacob's polygamous household resulted in 12 sons and 1 daughter. These sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin, became the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. This means the very foundation of God's chosen people arose from a polygamous household fraught with conflict and dysfunction. The rivalry between Leah and Rachel didn't just affect their relationship. It spilled over into the lives of their children. Reuben, Leah's firstborn, committed a grave offense by sleeping with Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant. Joseph, Rachel's firstborn, became Jacob's favorite child, sparking hatred and jealousy among his brothers. This sibling rivalry escalated to the point where Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, a decision that ultimately set the stage for the Israelites' migration to Egypt. What's remarkable is that the Bible doesn't sugarcoat this story. There's no attempt to portray Jacob's family as harmonious or ideal. Instead, the text lays bare the raw realities of polygamy, the jealousy, competition, and emotional wounds it causes. Yet, through all this, God's plan was still unfolding. The 12 sons of Jacob became the 12 tribes of Israel, fulfilling God's covenant with Abraham to make his descendants as numerous as the stars. David and Solomon are 2 of the most iconic figures in the Bible, not just for their achievements, but also for their deeply complicated lives. Polygamy isn't merely a subplot in their stories. It's central to their reigns and the way their personal lives influenced biblical history. This isn't about romanticized kingship, it's about how the realities of their polygamous relationships shaped their legacies. David, often called a man after God's own heart, didn't just marry multiple women. He used marriage as a tool for political alliances, personal desires, and consolidating power. After becoming king, David took multiple wives and concubines, including Ahinoam, Abigail, Haggith, Abital, and Eglah, as listed in 2 Samuel 3:2-5. Each marriage expanded his influence but also introduced chaos into his household. David's family life was a disaster. His polygamy created a web of jealousy and tragedy. One of the most infamous events involved Amnon, David's eldest son, who raped his half-sister Tamar, the daughter of Maacah. Tamar's brother Absalom avenged her by killing Amnon and later leading a rebellion against David. These weren't random acts of violence. They stemmed directly from the fractured dynamics of a polygamous family. The rivalries and power struggles among David's children were rooted in his multiple marriages and divided household. Then there's Solomon, David's son and successor. If David's polygamy caused problems, Solomon's took it to another level. Solomon's 700 wives and 300 concubines weren't merely personal choices, they were a calculated political strategy. Marrying foreign princesses helped Solomon forge alliances, secure peace, and expand Israel's influence. However, this came at a significant cost. 1 Kings 11 explains how Solomon's foreign wives turned his heart away from God. They brought their gods and religious practices into Israel, leading Solomon to build high places for idols like Chemosh and Molech. These actions were outright violations of Israel's covenant with God. Solomon's spiritual decline, tied to his polygamy, set the stage for the eventual division of the kingdom after his death. Despite their failures, neither David nor Solomon lost their status as key figures in God's plan. David remained the ancestor of the Messiah, and Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, a monumental achievement in Israel's history. Their polygamy wasn't condoned, but it was recorded in detail along with its consequences. God continued to work through their lives, using even their shortcomings to shape the future of his people. Polygamy during their reigns wasn't just about personal choices or cultural norms. It was deeply tied to the politics and power dynamics of ancient monarchies. For David and Solomon, polygamy was both a tool and a trap. It brought influence, but also led to family and spiritual dysfunction. The Mosaic Law takes an intriguing approach to polygamy. It regulates it without outright condemning it. For a legal code given directly by God, this raises critical questions about how polygamy was understood within the biblical framework. This is not a gray area. It is addressed head-on, and the details reveal much about life in ancient Israel. One of the clearest examples is found in Exodus 21 verse 10, which states that if a man takes a second wife, he must not deprive the first wife of food, clothing, or marital rights. These aren't mere suggestions, they are obligations written into the law. The text is direct and practical, assuming polygamy will occur and setting boundaries to protect the dignity and well-being of the first wife. This is significant. Instead of outlawing polygamy, the law ensures it operates within a framework of justice. Deuteronomy 21:15-17 goes further by addressing inheritance rights in polygamous families. It declares that if a man has two wives and loves one more than the other, he cannot favor the children of the loved wife when dividing his inheritance. The firstborn son, regardless of which wife bore him, must receive his rightful share. This law directly tackles favoritism and rivalry, which often plague polygamous households. It doesn't erase the practice, but works to minimize its potential for injustice. These laws were not theoretical, but practical responses to the social realities of ancient Israel. Polygamy was embedded in the culture, and these regulations ensured it didn't become an unchecked source of oppression or chaos. It's also noteworthy that these laws apply to men with multiple wives, not women with multiple husbands. This reflects the patriarchal structure of ancient Israelite society, where men held most of the power in family and social dynamics. However, the legal framework extended beyond individual families. Deuteronomy 17:17 specifically warns Israelite kings not to multiply wives for themselves, lest his heart turn away. This is fascinating because it doesn't forbid polygamy for kings outright, but warns against its excesses. The focus is on the potential for polygamy to lead to spiritual and moral compromise, as later seen in Solomon's reign. What's striking is the absence of an outright ban. Mosaic law prohibits numerous practices common in the ancient Near East, such as idolatry, human sacrifice, and even certain dietary customs. If polygamy were inherently sinful, one might expect a similar prohibition. Instead, it is regulated, suggesting that while it wasn't part of God's original design, it was accommodated within the broader framework of the covenant. This regulation highlights the balance between divine ideals and human realities. The law didn't aim to create a utopia, but to manage a society shaped by its time and place. Polygamy wasn't celebrated, but it also wasn't treated as taboo. It was acknowledged and addressed with rules designed to protect vulnerable individuals, particularly women and children, from exploitation and injustice. This pragmatic approach is a hallmark of Mosaic law, reflecting a God who engages with his people in their cultural and historical context. It provides guidelines that address real-world challenges. Polygamy was a reality in ancient Israel, and the law doesn't shy away from it. Instead, it establishes boundaries to ensure it operates within a framework of fairness and responsibility. Interestingly, the prophets of the Old Testament, often seen as Israel's moral watchdogs, remain surprisingly silent on the issue of polygamy. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Hosea fiercely condemned idolatry, oppression, and covenant unfaithfulness, yet none of them clearly call out polygamy as a sin. This silence isn't due to negligence or ignorance, but reflects their priorities and the cultural context of their time. Polygamy wasn't rare or hidden, it was visible and accepted in their society. The prophetic literature spans centuries of Israel's history and is saturated with fiery denunciations of moral failings. Yet, their focus remains on larger societal and spiritual issues, leaving polygamy uncondemned but regulated within the cultural norms of ancient Israel. Polygamy was a practiced reality among the people of Israel, including its kings and patriarchs, and it remained a consistent thread in their history. Take Hosea, for example. His entire prophetic ministry revolves around the metaphor of marriage, portraying Israel as an unfaithful wife to a faithful God. Hosea's personal life mirrors this message when he is commanded by God to marry Gomer, a promiscuous woman, as a symbol of Israel's spiritual adultery. Despite this vivid focus on marriage as a metaphor for covenant fidelity, Hosea does not critique polygamy. Instead, his message centers on spiritual unfaithfulness rather than the structure of human relationships. Similarly, Ezekiel and Jeremiah focus on covenant unfaithfulness, often using marriage and adultery as symbols of Israel's idolatry. These prophets do not hesitate to condemn practices that erode the moral fabric of society. Yet they remain silent on the issue of polygamy. This silence is not accidental, but reflects a strategic focus on addressing larger spiritual and societal crises plaguing Israel. Isaiah, often called the Prince of Prophets, tackles a wide range of issues, from social justice to spiritual renewal. His vision of a future messianic kingdom is one of profound moral and spiritual restoration. Yet even within this grand vision, polygamy is not singled out as a practice requiring reform. The absence of critique suggests that the prophets viewed polygamy as a social reality to be managed rather than a moral failure to be condemned. This silence can also be understood in light of the cultural and legal framework of ancient Israel. As previously discussed, polygamy was regulated under Mosaic Law and deeply embedded in the social structure. For the prophets, addressing systemic issues like idolatry, corruption, and injustice took precedence over challenging a culturally ingrained practice that was not explicitly prohibited by the law. This silence does not imply approval, but forces us to reconsider how polygamy was perceived in the biblical context. The prophets were not concerned with reshaping Israelite society to conform to modern moral standards. Their focus was on restoring Israel's relationship with God and ensuring obedience to the covenant. While polygamy was complex and often fraught with problems, it was not seen as a primary obstacle to these spiritual goals. Another intriguing aspect of the prophetic writings is their use of marriage imagery to describe God's relationship with his people. God is often portrayed as a husband to Israel, a single wife, emphasizing exclusivity and faithfulness in the covenant. This metaphor reinforces the ideal of monogamy as God's original design, but does not translate into an outright condemnation of polygamy in human relationships. Polygamy in the Bible is not a glitch or an oversight, but a thread deliberately woven into the narrative. As messy and controversial as it is, this practice repeatedly serves as a backdrop for God's work in a fallen world. What emerges is not just a record of human relationships, but a deeper insight into how God operates within human imperfection to advance his ultimate plan. Throughout Scripture, polygamy reflects human nature, our struggles with jealousy, power, and desire, while simultaneously highlighting God's sovereignty and using flawed systems to fulfill his promises. Consider the broader pattern. The patriarchs, kings, and tribes of Israel all bear the marks of polygamous unions. Yet, these same stories showcase God's profound work. The 12 tribes of Israel, born out of Jacob's tangled family dynamics, became the foundation of a nation chosen to bear God's covenant. David's complex family, rife with betrayal and conflict, still played a pivotal role in advancing God's plan, ultimately leading to the lineage of the Messiah. Solomon's wisdom and the grandeur of his temple, despite his spiritual failings, symbolized Israel at its peak. What stands out in the biblical narrative is how polygamy is neither glorified nor erased. The Bible presents it in all its complexity, unflinchingly exposing the pain, rivalry, and injustice it often created. At the same time, it reveals how God chose to work through these flawed structures. This isn't a celebration of polygamy, but a testament to divine patience and purpose. God didn't demand perfection before acting. Instead, he entered human history as it was, messy, broken, and far from ideal. One critical takeaway from these stories is the tension between divine ideals and human realities. In the earliest chapters of Genesis, monogamy is presented as God's original design, one man and one woman united in a covenant of mutual love and respect. Yet, as humanity deviated from this ideal, God did not abandon them. He didn't impose an immediate overhaul of cultural practices like polygamy. Instead, he engaged with humanity where they were, using even their imperfect systems to carry out his plan. The legal framework established in Mosaic Law underscores this principle. By regulating polygamy rather than outlawing it, God demonstrated an understanding of human limitations and the cultural realities of the time. These laws weren't about endorsing polygamy, they were about mitigating harm and protecting the vulnerable in a world far removed from Eden's perfection. In the New Testament, the focus shifts drastically. Polygamy fades into the background, replaced by teachings that emphasize monogamy as the model for Christian marriages. Passages like 1 Timothy 3:2 and Titus 1:6 set the expectation that church leaders be the husband of one wife. This shift isn't presented as a condemnation of Old Testament practices, but rather as a reflection of a renewed focus on the covenantal ideal. What this pattern reveals is profound. God's work isn't limited by human brokenness. The presence of polygamy in the Bible isn't an endorsement. It's a reminder of God's ability to use even our failures to fulfill his purposes. Whether through the dysfunction of Jacob's household, the political alliances of Solomon, or the regulations of Mosaic Law, God's plan continued to unfold. These stories challenge us to approach the Bible with open eyes and a willingness to wrestle with its complexities. The Bible is not a sanitized moral guidebook. Instead, it is a raw, unfiltered account of how God interacts with humanity in all its messiness. Polygamy is just one of many examples where human choices collide with divine purpose, resulting in a narrative that is richer, deeper, and more honest than we often give it credit for. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video and engage with a topic as complex as it is fascinating. Your time and attention mean everything, and I hope this exploration of biblical polygamy has given you a fresh perspective on Scripture. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you find this content valuable. I look forward to diving into more thought-provoking topics with you in the next video.